Even as they were talking, they turned a corner into what appeared to be the village square. There was a bonfire blazing at its center, and all around it, illuminated by its light, a large crowd. There were Saxons of all ages, even tiny children in their parents' arms, and Axel's first thought was that they had stumbled upon a pagan ceremony. But as they stopped to consider the scene before them, he saw that there was no focus to the crowd's attention. The faces he could see were solemn, perhaps frightened. Voices were lowered and collectively came through the air as a worried murmur. A dog barked at Axel and Beatrice and was promptly chased away by shadowy figures. Those among the crowd who noticed the visitors stared their way blankly before losing interest. "Who knows what concerns from here, Axel," Beatrice said. "I'd walk away, except the medicine woman's house is somewhere near. Let me see if I can still find my way to it." As they moved towards a row of huts to their right, they became aware of many more people in the shadows, silently watching the crowd around the fire. Beatrice stopped to talk to one of them, a woman standing in front of her own door, and after a while Axel realized that this was the medicine woman herself. He could not see her well in the near darkness, but made out the straight-backed figure of a tall woman, probably in her middle years, clutching a shawl around her arms and shoulders. She and Beatrice went on conferring in low voices, sometimes glancing toward the crowd, sometimes at Axel. Eventually the woman gestured for them to enter her hut, but Beatrice, coming up to him, said softly, "Let me speak with her alone, Axel. Help me take off this bundle and wait out here for me." "Can I be with you, Princess, even if I hardly understand this Saxon tongue?" "These are women's matters, husband. Let me talk with her alone, and she's saying she'll examine my old body carefully." "I'm sorry, Princess. I wasn't thinking clearly. Let me take your bundle from you, and I'll be waiting here as long as you wish." After the two women had gone inside, Axel felt a great weariness, especially in his shoulders and legs. Removing his own burden, he leaned against the turf wall behind him and gazed over at the crowd. There was now a growing restlessness. People would stride from the darkness around him to join the crowd, while others hurried away from the fire, only to return a moment later. The blaze illuminated some faces sharply, while leaving others in shadows. But after a time, Axel came to the conclusion that these people were all waiting in a state of some anxiety for someone or something to emerge from the timber hall to the left of the fire. This building, probably some meeting place for the Saxons, must have had a fire of its own burning inside, for its windows flickered between the blackness and light. He was on the verge of nodding off, his back to the wall, the muffled voices of Beatrice and the medicine woman somewhere behind him, when the crowd surged and shifted, letting out a soft collective growl. Several men had emerged from the timber hall and were walking towards the fire. The crowd parted and quieted for them, as though in expectation of an announcement. But none came, and soon people were pressing around the newcomers, their voices building again. Axel noticed that attention was focused almost entirely on the man who had come out last from the hall. He was probably no more than 30, but had about him a natural authority. Although he was dressed simply, as a farmer might be, he did not look like anyone else in the village. It was not just the way he had swept his cloak over one shoulder, revealing his belt and the handle of his sword, nor was it simply that his hair was longer than any of the villagers. It hung almost down to his shoulders, and he had tied it up with some thong to prevent it swaying over his eyes. In fact, the actual thought that crossed Axel's mind was that this man had tied his hair to stop it falling across his vision during combat. This thought had come to Axel quite naturally, and only on reflection did it startle him, for it had carried with it an element of recognition. Moreover, when the stranger striding into the midst of the crowd allowed his hand to fall and rest on the sword handle, Axel had felt almost tangibly the peculiar mix of comfort, excitement, and fear such a movement could bring. Telling himself he would return to these curious sensations at some later point, he shut them out of his mind and concentrated on the scene unfolding before him. It was the bearing of the man, the way he moved and held himself, that so set him apart from those around him. No matter that he tries to pass himself off as an ordinary Saxon, Axel thought, this man is a warrior, and perhaps one capable of wreaking great devastation when he wishes it. Two of the other men who had emerged from the hall were hovering nervously behind him, and whenever the warrior drifted further into the crowd, both men tried their best to stay near him. Like children anxious not to be left behind by a parent, the two men were both young, also wore swords, and in addition, each was clutching a spear. But it was evident that they were quite unaccustomed to such weapons. They were, moreover, stiff with fear, and seemed unable to respond to the words of encouragement their fellow villagers were giving them. Their gazes darted about in panic, even as hands patted their backs or squeezed their shoulders. The long-haired fellow is a stranger, arrived only an hour or two before us, Beatrice's voice said close to his ear. A Saxon, but one from a distant country. The Finlands in the east, so he says, where he's lately been fighting the sea raiders. Axel had been aware for some time that the voices of the women had grown more distinct, and turning, saw that Beatrice and her hostess had come out of the house and were standing at the door just behind them. The medicine woman now spoke softly for some time in Saxon, after which Beatrice said into his ear, "It seems earlier today one of the village men came back out to breathe and his shoulder was wounded, and when prevailed upon to calm himself, told of how he and his brother, together with his nephew, a boy of 12, were fishing at their usual spot by the river and were set upon by 2 ogres. Except according to this wounded man, these were no ordinary ogres, monstrous and able to move faster and with greater cunning than any ogre he'd ever seen. The fiends, for it's by that name these villagers were talking of them, the fiends killed his brother outright and carried off the boy, who was alive and struggling. The wounded man himself got away only after a long chase along the river path. The foul grunts came closer behind him all the while, but he outran them in the end. That would be him there now, Axel, with the splint on his arm, talking to the stranger. Wounded though he was anxious enough for his nephew to lead a party of this village's strongest men back to the spot, and they saw smoke from a campfire near the bank, and as they were creeping up to it, their weapons at the ready, the bushes open, and it seems these same 2 fiends had set a trap. The medicine woman says 3 men were killed even before the others sought to run for their lives, and though they returned unhurt, most of them are now shivering and muttering to themselves in their beds, too shaken to come out, and wish well these brave men, willing to go out now, even with the darkness coming and the mist setting in, to do what couldn't be done by 12 strong men in broad daylight.